Hello. For our presentation, we had to choose either a crop, plant, or disease from the Colombian Exchange. Our group decided to do a presentation on chickenpox. We will cover the ancient origins, when and how the global exchange happened, and short-term and long-term environmental and social effects from chickenpox. First, we'll talk about the ancient origins. Chickenpox has been around for years, but it is not always known what it came from. Even the name is a little bit controversial about its origin. One theory is that it is called chickenpox because the blisters it causes looks like chickpeas. Another theory is that it is called that because it looks like peck marks from a chicken. The word chickenpox also comes from the word gitchen, which means itching in the Old English language. For a while, people even thought that chickenpox and smallpox were the same thing, but they are not. William Herberton was the first person to figure out the difference between the two in 1767. Chickenpox was first identified by Razi in Babylonia in the year 800 AD. He documented some of the first known information about chickenpox. He also talked about the differences he noticed between smallpox and measles because they were going around as well. Giovanni was the first one that found more detailed information in the 1500s about chickenpox. He found that chickenpox is from the Varicella zoster virus and the herpes simplex virus. He is the one responsible for the definition of chickenpox and some of the information we know today.
Now that we've talked about the origins of chickenpox, I'd like to move on to when the global exchange happened for chickenpox. More specifically, how did chickenpox get to North America? Well, the global exchange for chickenpox came with a large assortment of other diseases that came over in the Colombian Exchange. This took place in 1942 when Columbus came to the Americas. Many of the indigenous people contracted diseases such as chickenpox. However, the Colombian Exchange wasn't all bad. The Europeans brought new crops and domesticated animals to the New World. The native people had never seen domestic animals such as horses, and in the future this grew quite useful for them. The Europeans also burned and stripped down the forests in order to make farmland for their new crops. However, this deforestation affected the natural wildlife that was already native to the area because these plants could not take the direct sunlight, and as a effect from that, the new European weeds that came over with the new crops just began to take over because the old plants could not handle the direct sunlight and the stampeding horses over them at all times. But all in all, the Colombian Exchange brought both good and bad things. Like, it brought domesticated animals for the natives like horses, but it also brought a wide variety of diseases such as chickenpox.
The chickenpox, also known as the varicella zoster virus, VZV, is an airborne disease. What this means is that when you are exposed to the virus, you must inhale small particles that are floating in the air to contract this disease. These particles can come from things such as coughs, sneezes, and the exchange of saliva. Because this is an airborne disease, it is easily spreadable. So when the Europeans came over to North America, they also brought the chickenpox with, which was, again, easily spreadable. Because the chickenpox was not in North America, there was no immune system buildup. The Europeans had developed immunity and antibodies to this disease, while the native people did not have either. When you get the chickenpox, it starts off as a rash that then begins to get itchy. These itchy parts of the rash are filled with fluids and begin to form blisters, which ends up turning into a scab. Chickenpox spread throughout the whole entire body and can even spread into your mouth and onto your eyes. As a result of this disease, many Caribbean islanders, Native Americans, and Amerindians were all affected, and many died.
Now that we have talked about how the chickenpox happened, I will be talking about the short-term environmental effects and the short-term social effects of chickenpox. Chickenpox was new, and since nobody had been introduced to it before, it was highly contagious, and many adults and children got the disease. This affected America both socially and environmentally. Since the disease was so new, it started to wipe out the population in North America. Due to the population being wiped out, things like plants and animals in the environment were not being taken care of as often as they were before. So that led to people not being able to get things that they were able to get to before, since there were not as many people producing things. Chickenpox cases occurred at their lowest rate during September, and in the long term was in March.
All right. Next, we're going to talk about some long-term environmental and social effects that resulted from chickenpox and the Colombian Exchange. So the main thing that happened is the European settlers came to the Americas, and the Europeans had been building up immunity against diseases like chickenpox for decades. So they were a lot better off. Their body was better at fighting off this disease. So when they spread it to the Native Americans, they had had no previous exposure to chickenpox. So being that they had no immunity, it quickly wiped out many Native Americans. In a 60-year span, some studies have said that nearly 87% of Native Americans may have died in a 60-year span, which is a pretty critical number, especially when you're thinking about like a pandemic and a spreadable disease. So as the Native Americans died, it tended to open up space where they had previously been hunting, gathering resources, establishing villages and things like that. So this allowed the European settlers to work with more wildlife, forestry, agriculture space. And the Europeans remained mostly unaffected by this because, like I had mentioned, they had been building up immunity to chickenpox for a long time. So what we saw was a major population decrease in the Americas amongst the Native Americans. Many tribes were even completely wiped out by chickenpox. And then I'd say the last environmental effect that I want to touch on is that there was an increase in forest fires after the Europeans came. This is because they were a lot more aggressive and efficient in how they would destroy the forests and use the timber to heat their homes in the winter time and allow them cooking and other various uses that they use for heat that they obtained from the wood from the forests. So I would say the most critical long-term environmental and social effect would be the major wipeout of Native Americans across the Americas. And that's probably the most important result that we need to learn about as a result from chickenpox and the Colombian Exchange.
In conclusion, today you learned about the Colombian Exchange of the chickenpox disease. We talked about the ancient origins, mentioning theories and detailed information about the disease. We also went into detail about when the Colombian Exchange happened and what it was. That was then followed up with how the disease was spread along with who it affected and what the chickenpox really is. Finally, we talked about the short and long-term environmental and social effects. We touched on the effects between the Native Americans and the Europeans along with major land effects. We hope you learned something new today.